Is Jay in the sound booth?
Yes.
Okay. And you're ready for my talk to be in English, right?
Quindi la lezione sarà in inglese.
Molto in inglese. Una cosa che forse vorrei aggiungere a quelli che parlano italiano, che anche ho fatto la licenza in filosofia presso questo Ateneo. Quindi penso che è una prospettiva interessante. I was just saying I did my licentiate in philosophy with this Athenaeum. My professor was Father Alain Contact, who's a great professor, and it's the inspiration for the material that we're going to see today. All right. So thank you, Father, not Father, but thank you, Alberto, for the introduction. Okay, so some of you have seen me already. I was here last week. So I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much, although some of the things that we see have to coincide, because as we're going to see, the concept of nature and the concept of substance that we developed last week are actually very similar. In fact, we're going to see that they're actually practically synonymous, at least the way I'm going to take it. Another thing to keep in mind is that in philosophy there are schools, and they're all legitimate schools. It's not as if we can say that St. Augustine is wrong and St. Thomas Aquinas is right about everything, or Aristotle is right and Plato is wrong about everything. There are different ways to look at different problems. I have chosen one way that I happen to think is the best way, and I offer it to you as a way of, because I think it will be helpful. And also because it is historically the way in which certain concepts in ethics have been formulated over time. For example, the concept of natural law, which comes from all the way back to the time of Cicero and the Stoics, but was made popular by the medieval theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. The concept of nature that is implied in the name natural law is basically the one I'm going to expose. So the title of this talk is Human Nature and What It Means for a Post-Human Society. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'll explain a little bit in a minute, is we're going to understand what the philosophers have historically meant by the term nature, how we should understand that when we say human nature and what that means, and then finally, what implications that has for ethics in general, and then for the problem that we've been seeing this week, okay, transhumanism, posthumanism, human enhancement. I'm only going to give very broad principles. I believe you've been seeing things in greater detail, scientific data, specific problems. Since I'm giving the philosophical principles, the ethical consequences are going to be very general, but I think it'll still be a help. My goal, we've already started a bit later than I intended. My goal is to talk maybe, at least to give some time for questions at the end, because some of these concepts take a little bit of, let me put it this way. I spent an entire year studying these, or 2 years studying these things. I'm going to have a hard time compressing it into 45 minutes, and that's normal. So I would welcome you to do more reading about it later, or ask questions. Okay. So this outline is basically what this session is going to be about. The first point, or the first chapter, will be nature, that is, in general, nature, what it is and what it isn't. Okay, this is probably the most boring part because I have to introduce things for the first time. Then specifically what exactly we mean by human nature and its relation to concrete human beings like you and me. From that we can make some implications, we can draw some conclusions that will help us, that will help anybody do a good ethics or moral theology, right? That's the third chapter. And then finally, some principles that we can draw that have to do with human enhancement and transhumanism. So if there's one thing that I would like everyone to take away from this session, it's this, is that there's no such thing as human nature in the air. Okay, we have to be careful of not turning an abstraction and personifying it into a thing. Okay, so I have here as a subtitle, Nature is Just a Thing, and I'll explain exactly what I mean when I say this. I said that my subtitle here is Nature is Just a Thing, and I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that. All right. First, some boring terminology stuff that I want to get through. Okay, the person who made the term nature popular was Aristotle. He was not the first person to use the term. Okay, if anybody has anybody done philosophical studies in the past? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. Okay, a good number. A good number, of course. That's it. If you've ever studied the pre-Socratic philosophers, okay, the ones that go from Thales up to, well, before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, which is the golden age of Greek philosophy. There were many authors who made works that they called periphyseos, okay, which means regarding nature or on nature. Okay, the first one who had a work entitled this was Parmenides, that I'm aware of. And in any case, this word, I better point at it on the screen, physis, is what the Greeks used to mean nature. Okay, it originally comes from the Greek verb phyo, which means to bring forth, to engender, sometimes to beget, just to say to reproduce, right? Okay, and it's from this word that we get words like physics, physiology, physical, physician, and so forth. This word was translated into Latin as natura, I believe by the Stoic philosophers that were Latin, like Seneca and Cicero. Okay, you will see in Latin works, there are a lot of philosophical works that are called De Rerum Natura, which is literally on the nature of things. Okay, that comes from the Latin verb nascor, which means to be born. Okay, and from there we get words in English like native or nation and nature. Now, the thing to get in our heads is that when Aristotle came up with this term, or when he used it, and this is what medieval philosophers took up, he wasn't thinking about, he didn't take it in the sense that we mean it today. Okay, so why don't we begin with saying what nature is not, at least what nature is not for our purposes in this discussion. I think the most common usage nowadays, if one says, okay, what's nature? Actually, why don't we do this exercise right now? Without worrying about what you've heard this week, if I had told you last week, what is nature, what would you have said? Did somebody answer for me? Define nature. Yes. Okay, that's one way. But if you ask a person on the street, what do they think of? Mountains, lakes, wildlife, right? So you could say the most common usage nowadays is to think of nature as that which is untouched by man, more or less. Okay. So you could say, my way of putting it is, it's the opposite of artificial. Like that which has not required human intervention. Okay, so in that sense, we talk about natural resources. Okay, oil and natural gas and iron ore, stuff that's in the earth, then we didn't put it there. Natural flavoring, right? Supposedly it's better because it's extracted directly from the fruit, even though that's silly because the artificial flavoring is exactly the same. It's just chemically synthesized. Okay, you'll see on packaging, oh, it's all natural. I guess that makes it better. I don't know why. If somebody has studied a bit of political philosophy, you know, John Locke and who are those guys? Hobbes and those philosophers talked about the state of nature, also Rousseau. That's more or less what they meant. It meant the state, in this case of man, as he was before he entered into society. And then, by a sort of, I better move this out of my way. I keep hitting it. Anyway, by a sort of epistemological jump, sometimes we come to a personification or a hypostatization of nature, of the former kind of nature. Okay, we talk about Mother Nature or the forces of nature. Okay, what created Mount Everest in the Himalayas? Oh, we say it was the forces of nature. It wasn't the forces of nature, it was the tectonic plates that caused Mount Everest, right? There's no such thing as Mother Nature. Okay, I'm not trying to say that these are wrong necessarily. I'm just saying that isn't what we mean when we talk about natural law or we talk about human nature. That's the important thing. And the reason for that is that if we fall into this trap, if you want to call it that, we could fall into something called the naturalistic fallacy. And I think it's an actual serious philosophical problem. And the fallacy is as follows. From the fact that something is natural, in this sense, it must follow that it's better. Otherwise, people wouldn't advertise natural flavorings. Right? It must be better because it's natural. Or, spoiler alert, the Catholic Church does not approve of homosexual acts, for example. But a common argument is, because homosexual tendencies exist, and they're not chosen by the persons who have them, they must be good. Right, that's certainly debatable. Or perhaps more commonly, everybody's doing it, it can't be wrong. It's an example of this fallacy. In order to avoid that, it's useful to go back to what Aristotle actually meant and what the medievals generally meant by the term nature. All right. So in the first place, okay, we can discern two meanings in the writings of the philosophers, especially Aristotle. A nature, a physis, notice that I had the article here, is a concrete thing. Correct. Right, not a cement thing. I mean a... In Italian, there's two different words. I know. I remember when I was little, it's like, don't be abstract, be concrete. Yeah. So should I be concrete or should I be poured cement or just seeing if you're awake this morning? Okay, for example, a stone or a maple tree or a chimpanzee or a jellyfish or a human being like you and me. Each of those, for Aristotle, is a physis, is a nature. Aristotle, okay, if you know a little bit about the politics of ancient philosophy, was anti-Platonic. Okay, he was the pupil of Plato, and he rejected some of his master's theses. The most important one of which was that Plato thought that the universal is where reality lies. A man is a man because he participates in the form of man, which exists somewhere in the, he calls it the hyperuranion. Aristotle says, no, this is nonsense. There's no such thing as the abstract man somewhere. There's only people. Okay, so this first meaning, and understand that there is a bit of a transition in modern languages, but for Aristotle, a nature was first and foremost a thing, or a person, depending on the case. It's a synonym for Aristotle of substance. Okay, for those of us who endured my talk last week, okay, nature is just another way of saying substance or essence. Aristotle even uses the same word. Secondarily, nature can refer to that which is common to all members of a class. So, for example, when we think about all human beings as a group, as a species, as we would say, there is something in common that we all share. There's an aspect of us that is exactly the same in every one of us. There is a set of characteristics or traits, or whatever you want to call it, that are essential. We're going to see what that is a little bit further on. And we can call that mankind, or human nature, or whatever you want to call it. That's nature in this secondary sense. Now, I should point out that in modern languages, the second sense tends to prevail. That's not a problem, but just something to be aware of. Okay, when I say, why are people always so greedy? I don't know. Oh, that's human nature. Okay, that's in the second sense. However, and again, there's no such thing as human nature in the abstract. All that we have are human beings, and all of them participate in this human nature. Okay. We are all members of the same species, and I'm going to explain a little bit what that means. And because of that, we have certain essential characteristics, okay? We all have, I'm going to explain a little bit later on what this means, we all have rational life, we all have intellectual knowledge and love. Okay, we also are always incarnate. Okay, there's no such thing as a human being without a body. Well, it's not a natural condition. All right. So, another thing that can be helpful is to understand, okay, well, here's an example of a nature. For those who were in my class last week, okay, remember that I spent a lot of time, I'm not going to do it today, but distinguishing the substance, also known as essence, also known as nature, from those characteristics or attributes or accidents that are inherent in that substance. Okay, it should be obvious that the tree is a single unified organism, okay, even though it has changed from an acorn all the way up to an adult tree. But it has never lost its oak tree-ness, if you want to call it that, its oak tree nature. It has never changed from, I don't know, being a fairy into being a tree. I mean, it's absurd, right? On the other hand, okay, it's not as if the greenness or the size or the place don't exist. They're just intrinsically tied to the substance. Right? You cannot have these properties without the actual subsistent organism. Okay. For those who had me last time, also those who have had my course on the subject, okay. Substance, essence, which Aristotle calls, in both cases, ousia, and nature, all three of those, refer to the same reality. So I am a substance, an essence, and a nature, so is every one of you. So is a tree, so is a rock, so is, an abalone, so is a crab, so is a bacterium, and so forth. The difference is the connotation that each term has. L'accettazione, sì. Sì. Substance refers to the fact that it subsists, mostly, right? So it's supposed to be in contrast to the accidents that are inherent. Okay, it's not important here. Essence refers to the fact that this entity is well defined. Okay? It has a specific manner or mode of being. Okay, Aristotle even takes pains, and something you could read if you would like in the book 7 of the Metaphysics, okay, where Aristotle explains that what it means to be a substance is that it has to answer the question, what is it? Okay, that's this first thing. That says to TST. Okay, literally it means what is it? Okay, so the idea is the following. So I have this tree, for example, and I could start describing it. Okay, it's green, it's got brown bark, it is large, it's located in a field, but none of those things answers the question, what is it? It only answers the question, what's it like? Right? The only thing that can answer the question, what is it, is substance or essence or nature. Okay? And he even uses this very curious expression, which I won't get into in detail, to TNA9, but it means what you are just because you are. What you are just because you are. It's written there. So, for instance, the idea is, okay, going back to my favorite example, it's not the greenness that makes it a tree or an oak. It's not the bark that makes it an oak. It's not its size that makes it an oak. What makes it an oak is its X, its essence or its nature. See? All right. We use the term nature to connote. It's the same reality. We're talking about a tree or a man or an abalone or a crab. I'm giving Jay a hard time with these words, but that's fine. But anyway, so we have this nature or the substance, and when we call it a nature, we're specifically referring to the fact that it is active, that it does stuff. Okay, that's why we tend to use this term when we talk about ethics, because ethics is all about action, human action. Okay, so for example, even a stone, which is a nature, has operation. It still hurts when I stub my toe against it. I could throw it off and hit somebody in the head with the stone and it would make an injury. Okay, it doesn't have very interesting actions, but it has them. Okay, there's no such thing as a being that doesn't operate. So inasmuch as this substance is a principle of operation, we call it a nature, which it always is. It's always a principle of operation. Okay? So, take home of all this, nature is not this abstract thing that is floating in the air of our epistemological imagination. It's not a hypostatization of that, excuse me. It also is not restricted to that which is not affected by human intervention. What it means is a something that is well-defined and has a very well-defined operation or action, which is any substance that there is. Okay? Any substance that is, right. All right. those who have had my course from last week will recognize this diagram. I'm not going to, this is not part of the course, if you like. I just want to illustrate that this idea of substance or nature as a principle of operation. If you look at the green circle, which is surrounded by a bright red circle, that is the substance, that is the thing. And emanating from that are its principal attributes, like its powers, its faculties. Okay, the next circle, that's the pale red circle. Then there are its habits. Okay, for the moment, I'm going to gloss over that. The important thing is the dark red circle that's on the outside. Those are its actions or operations. Okay, so if I get angry at somebody and I give them a punch in the nose, that was one of my operations. It came from me. I don't have any excuse. That's all. That's all I want to, that's the important point here. So, because I, as a substance, am capable of doing things, I'm capable of walking, of eating, and sleeping, and then of more interesting things like intellectual knowledge and intellectual love, that makes me a nature, and it makes every one of us a nature. And then, as I said, normally when we talk about human nature, for example, we tend to think of it in the abstract as that which is common, necessarily, to each one of us. Okay, now here is an important point, and it's going to have a very serious implication for what we're talking about in this week. Nature is unchangeable. Unlike the accidents and the attributes, which can vary and vary quite a bit, okay? That oak tree that's in the example started out as a little itty-bitty acorn, and after 20 years is an enormous tree. However, it is the same organism, it's the same substance, and the same nature. So a substance remains itself throughout its existence or lifetime. The only way to change a nature is to corrupt it and generate a new one. So, for example, if that oak tree got struck by lightning, it would become oak wood. It would stop being an oak tree and just be the raw wood, right? Then if I took that wood and burned it, I could turn it into charcoal. It would stop being wood and it would become charcoal. Then when I used it in my barbecue, it would transform from a charcoal into carbon dioxide and water, using the oxygen in the air. Each one of those transformations is called a generation and corruption. And you see, the only way to get that to happen is to destroy the first substance and make a new one. Okay, or at least destroy it, like in the case of us who have an immortal soul, we don't quite destroy the substance, you just destroy the body. But as far as in the material world, the transition is very similar. Like the death of a human being works kind of like this. It stops being, what you see before you stops being a human being and starts being a cadaver. It's a little bit grisly, I'm sorry. Okay, and for example, examples of generations and corruption are fertilization and death in organisms. Okay, we saw that when we, those of you who had the course with me, we saw this ad nauseum. And it was one of the reasons that we could say with confidence that the human person begins at conception, and as far as we're concerned on earth, ends with natural death. Natural or otherwise, ends with the death of the human being. Okay. The reason for that, the reason why nature is unchangeable, is because it's precisely what makes you what you are. If I changed from a human being into an elephant, whatever that means, I would stop being a human being and I would start being an elephant. And so I would actually stop being me. You can't just transform into something else without losing yourself. It doesn't work that way. Because you start out, I mean, you have to be what you are. There's no alternative. Any change that doesn't change what you are is an accidental change. Okay, the oak tree grows. The oak tree can change colors in the autumn, but it doesn't stop being what it is. I'll explain in a little bit why I think that has happened in the modern concept of transhumanism. I'll get to that in just a minute. But I want to talk about, that was nature in general, and that's the most boring part. Don't worry, it gets faster as we do the second and third and fourth part. I want to talk about what makes us a special kind of nature. Okay, we have in common what all natures have. That is being. We also have in common what all living creatures have, which is life. We also have in common what all the animals have, which is animal life or sensitive life. And we have something special that goes beyond that. So, I've made this argument before, I'm going to have to be brief, but if you look at creation, you notice that it's not homogeneous. So, for example, I mentioned stones, I mentioned, oak trees. I don't know if I mentioned them yet, but oh yes, I did. I mentioned crabs and abalones. I've mentioned chimpanzees, and I've mentioned human beings. Now, if you examine their operation, what they're capable of doing, you notice that stones pretty much are able to lie there, and that's about it. You go up a notch, and you look at the bacteria and the fungi and the trees and the plants, and you notice that they can do more things. Okay, they can take in nutrients, they can grow, they can reproduce. They don't do much else. Everything else that they do, like photosynthesis and all that kind of stuff, is in function of nutrition and growth, and eventually reproduction. Go up a notch, and you look at the animals, and they can do something much more interesting. They're actually capable of visualizing objects. Like they can actually see and know in a way that's sensitive what they're looking at. Okay, the dog recognizes its owner. I can teach a chimpanzee signs, and it can repeat them back to me as a developed memory. So on and so forth. But mankind can do something very different. It can do all those things. And in addition, he is capable of intellectual knowledge and intellectual love. What do I mean by that? Intellectual knowledge, which is the easier case, means two things. It means that I can know essences. Okay, we define that as what it is. So not only can I take my food, as the animals can, I can know what it is. I can know who my friends are. I can know who I am. An animal cannot do that. Not even a chimpanzee. Not even the most advanced apes do that. It also means, second thing, it means that I can make a judgment about being. about existence. Okay, that's why we speak and write in terms and propositions. Okay, the terms represent the things that are known, the essences, and the propositions say aye or nay. They say whether it exists or doesn't. Propositions say aye or nay. Dicono sì o no. You don't have to translate back into English.
No, I didn't know it. I know you were pointing to Scottish dialect. So.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yay or nay.
Yay or nay. Thank you. In American English, you say, in the American Congress, you say aye and nay, but that's okay. Yep. Anyway. So the proposition says yay or nay. Yes, it exists, or no, it does not. Okay, so if I say this is a black microphone, everyone says, yes, that's a black microphone. If I say this is a turquoise microphone, you're like, are you seeing properly? Right? So I think the easiest, and again, I'm not going to spend time on this, but I think the easiest evidence that human beings have a much, much greater capacity than any other animal is that we use language in the proper sense. Even the chimpanzees that are taught, cocoa and those animals, they were able to memorize signs, and they were able to remember that certain signs brought them food and stuff, or that it made their trainers happy and that kind of thing. But that's not the same thing as having language. I mean, try asking Coco whether Coco is a rational being. I don't think it would have any, it wouldn't work. Ask Coco, if animals have rights, how come animals don't go on protests to demand their rights? Well, because they're not capable of it. If you want to amuse yourself, you should Google The Onion and animal rights, and they have all kinds of things about how they can't believe that animals don't protest for their rights. I can't recommend everything on The Onion, but sometimes it really is fun. So this is all to say that different species have different degrees, and I know this is a controversial thing nowadays, but it all stems from the notion of nature. Okay. If nature is what you are, and nature doesn't change as long as you exist, it follows that nature tells you how much perfection you have. Okay, and different species have different degrees of perfection or nobility. Okay, starting from the stone and going all the way up to man. Okay, and okay, maybe there are some people who are not more noble than stones, but I don't think so. I mean, that's a joke. Some people are sleeping as if they were stones, but that's another question. Okay, and as I argued last week, okay, the special thing that we have, the special kind of being that we have, we call rational life. Life is actually the being or the existence of a living thing. And the kind that we have is called rational because it gives us, among other things, not only, but among other things, the capacity for intellectual knowledge and love. Okay, here's a chart of the degrees of being that starts all the way down from non-living substances up to God the Creator. All right. If this were an honest chart, the distances would grow every time you go up a level.
Would you say geometric?
More like logarithmic. It keeps increasing. Yeah. So, I mean, the distance from non-living to vegetative life is relatively small. The distance from vegetative life to sensitive life is even greater. The distance from sensitive life to rational life goes off the chart. From rational life to the first angel is even bigger. And then from the angels to God is infinite. Okay.
These are arithmetic distances here.
The point is they get bigger each time you, much bigger. Logarithmic is closer because at the end, God is off the, yeah. You can't really measure this kind of thing with a mathematical function, but just gives an idea. So, also, you can't do better, and this is again going to have an implication. Given that you have, an incarnate being, an animal with a body, you can't do better than a rational animal. The only way to get a more noble creature is to lose the body and become an angel, whatever that means. But as we said, substances can't change as long as they're in existence. So no, human beings don't become angels, never. And angels don't become humans. It's impossible. I'm sorry to disappoint. Is anybody here a fan of It's a Wonderful Life? That's okay to be a fan of It's a Wonderful Life, but theologically it's wrong. Clarence cannot be an angel. I'm sorry, he's a man. And he doesn't get wings. Angels don't have bodies. Sorry to debunk this. Penso che in italiano si chiama La vita è meravigliosa. Forse si conosce. Okay, so we now have all the boring part is done, and we can apply these principles to ethics. Okay, that's the third part, and then to transhumanism and that problem in particular. And now that we have this background, I think these applications are actually fairly straightforward. Okay, the first point I want to say, I think I said it at the beginning, is that this is the nature that's in natural law. Sometimes people think that natural law means that, well, it's that naturalistic fallacy. If it exists in nature, therefore it must be okay. Or, I've heard people argue against contraception and in favor of natural family planning because natural family planning doesn't use medicine, doesn't use, pills. Well, that really isn't the problem. It really has nothing to do with that. Because the nature in natural law has nothing to do with whether man is involved in it or not. It has to do with, the second point. And it has to do with the conformity that an action has with human nature. Here taken in that general common sense. Right? Because I don't do ethical judgments about only individuals. I do them about people in general. Right? Otherwise, it's not, it's not universalizably applicable. So the idea behind natural law, very briefly, it's actually very simple, is that an action is in conformity with natural law when it is compatible with human fulfillment and happiness. And if it's not, if it's guaranteed to make you miserable or to harm you, well, then it's immoral. Okay. That's all. That's really all that natural law is. And the way we tell what constitutes our happiness is by looking at our nature, by looking at how we're made. By looking at our nature, that is, by looking at how we are, how we're made. Okay, so I mean, a kind of a dumb example, but I need a body in order to fulfill my basic functions and to function in general. So it's not okay if I go and cut my own arms off. I wouldn't do that, but we're not free to do that because it's guaranteed to cause us a serious problem and cause us harm, obviously. And of course, I can't do it to somebody else either, because we all share the same human nature and taken universally. Okay. That's the idea behind natural law. Okay. Now, that's enough as a couple of general principles. And now we can turn to transhumanism. and what it means. Transhumanism and human enhancement. I'm only going to give very general principles because it's something that those who have studied the issue in detail, the scientific things that go on, to draw out the more particular principles. But I think we can say the following. Okay, so the first thing is that transhumanism is, I don't know, it's hard to define, but it usually is the idea that we could take us humans and transform us into something better, whatever that means. And then better is hard to define because since there's a very poor understanding of what human nature is and we don't have a standard by which to judge what's good and what's bad, it's hard to understand what exactly the goal is. But it usually means, you know, better enhanced intelligence and more beauty and more athletic prowess and that kind of thing. Okay. But I'm afraid to say transhumanism as such is a hoax. It's a hoax. Because you cannot transition from one nature to another without ceasing to exist. Right? The only way to go from one nature to another is generation and corruption. And when you corrupt, guess what? You die. If you're a human being. Right? So, it may be possible to do certain things that will make us or our progeny more intelligent or whatever, more have a higher IQ or something. I don't know that that's a good thing, but it might be possible. But that wouldn't make us superhuman. Okay, cyborgs and superheroes are strictly fictional. They're not going to happen. So, what I think has gone on here, and this is the second point, I think that transhumanism fails to distinguish between animal life and rational life. What I mean is, I think there is this evolutionary outlook that looks at, you know, the different living things as if it were a continuum, as if you could go from the bacterium up to mankind, and there is a gradual progression without any jumps. But in reality, there's nothing superior to rational life. How could you get better than that? Okay, we already have immortal souls with the capacity for intellectual knowledge and love that the animals don't have, and that is an enormous difference. Okay, we already have the capacity for intellectual knowledge and love, and therefore an enormous difference between animal life and our life. That is qualitatively different. It is a huge jump with a discontinuity. Okay, and I think it's not taken into consideration, possibly because of an evolutionary, not that I'm against evolution, but possibly because they've sort of extrapolated the data from biology into their philosophy. Okay, so in reality, we can't transition into a super race. And regarding that sort of project, okay, first of all, I don't think anybody would have any problem with the technology used for strictly therapeutic reasons. Okay, so if I come up with a wonderful prosthesis that replaces my hand entirely, okay, after I've lost it to an accident, I think not like anybody has any problem with that. Or if I have glasses, like occhiali, nobody has any problem with that. It might be possible to make man more capable of certain things, like have a higher IQ or more alertness and so forth. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but we have to be careful. Like, for example, if somebody invented glasses that help you see with 2010 vision, which is better than 2020 vision, okay, that's fine. But we have to be very careful because human enhancement is unlikely to be entirely beneficial. Okay, we look at things like steroids or amphetamine use, which is used to keep you awake, or even like high caffeine drinks and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so it gives you this effect that's desirable, like awakeness or physical prowess. But wait a minute, it also, stresses your liver, and it, has all these adverse effects on your body. So it's not that simple. So it is a pipe dream to say, we're going to make this better race of human beings, because there's always a trade-off. And so using CRISPR or whatever to do that, it's not worth the costs. Right? So I don't know, I really should transition to the next conference here, because we're out of time. But I don't know if there are any, if it'd be okay if we had a question or two. Yes, just briefly. Okay.
About the changes of the body, let's say, because now we have transgender.
Right. Right. I think I understood the question. So, okay. If I understood the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, the idea is, okay, so supposing we figured out how to make a cyborg, what would that do to your human nature, right? Would that make you something else or whatever? And the answer is no, it wouldn't. It wouldn't affect your human nature at all, because really cyborgs are people full of prosthetics. Right? I mean, you've changed the leg, you've changed the other leg, you've changed the arms, you've changed the eyes, you've changed the nose. Like Darth Vader. But really, it's just a human being with a lot of prosthetics. So he hasn't stopped being a human being. There's no change in nature in that. RoboCop, for example, or Terminator, or was that a real robot?
No, Terminator.
Okay. Yeah. Just to be clear. Yes. Did that answer your question?
But we can't define nature as a creation of God.
Absolutely.
Because in the Genesis,
Right.
It's mentioned that at the beginning, God created earth, sky, and earth, and then the animals, and
Sure.
then the human being. But now in my opinion, we are in the way of this transhumanist period.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, where is the God in this equation? Because all is rational. All we heard in this week was really rational, and we lost the sense. It means like a de-Christianization of this philosophy.
Now, I would kind of turn it on its head, the question. I think that we can come up with God with the proper understanding of what nature is. I think we can understand philosophically who God is based on the correct notion of what nature is. Also from theology, right? We can go, as Genesis does, from the top down. But we can start from the bottom, and based on a proper understanding of how the world works, we can understand that God is the creator. It's possible to do that. Okay, well, that's a whole course by itself, but it can be done. So I don't think that this notion of nature is in any way in conflict with God. On the contrary, it implies, albeit with difficulty, it implies a creator. Because if there weren't, it's the fourth way of St. Thomas, if you're not familiar. Because there are these degrees of being, there must be something with infinite being that brings it into being. Any other questions? I think there's something back there. Yes. There's the issue.
So just to be clear, you're saying that there must be corruption for something or generation in order for
at the same time, actually.
Yeah, for it's changed. Okay. So for So you're saying enhancement is possible, but we will never, or we cannot ever be transhuman, right? Is that
Correct. Because the best you could do, I mean, metaphysically speaking, the next step higher than human is angel. You'd have to lose the body entirely.
Yeah. But where's the line for you that we would just be corrupting our nature, not generating it?
When we die. So if you add enough prosthesis that the body doesn't support itself anymore.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Does Father Joseph have a question, or is he trying to get me to move?
Yesterday, we heard that there were 3 kinds of posthumans, right? They talked about. One is possibility of uploading your mind into a existence that is no longer corporeal. The other one is a new type of sentient beings that no longer could. It's a new species, right?
Right. I think we've already debunked the second one. Okay.
And then the third one, I forgot. Anyone can help me about the one. When basically,
he needs an enhancement.
Those are the 3 types of. He talked about 3 types of posthumans that are right. And what do you think about that? Would that be philosophically possible?
In a word, no. I don't remember what the third one is, but the second one I think I've just debunked.
Okay.
If you change the species, that's changing your nature.
But can you create a new species that is not human, that is also intellectual or has intellectual will?
But you can't get higher than rational.
Right. Well, so, it could be the same, but not.
You could conceive. Forgive the pun. You could conceivably make a class of human beings that is no longer genetically compatible with other human beings, but it wouldn't change the nature. It would still be a rational animal. So last year, I think it was, somebody asked, so what if an alien came to Earth? It's kind of a science fiction type thing, but that had a superior intelligence. Would the alien have the right to enslave human beings? Suppose it was an alien species. And the answer is no, because alien species are just as embodied as we are. And they're rational animals just like we are, so we're not really different, metaphysically speaking. And in any case, as soon as you reach rational life, any rational creature, from man all the way up to the biggest angel, has to be respected. Okay, so you already have a right to life and a right not to be enslaved just as soon as you're a human being. The right to dispose of creatures stops at being an animal, a non-human animal. Okay, so then there's the uploading, right?
Yeah, the first type of uploading the mind.
The thing is, uploading is not incorporeal.
It is not
incorporeal.
It's not incorporeal.
Correct.
It is not incorporeal.
Correct.
Okay. Non è incorporeal.
So it's actually a material thing.
È una cosa materiale.
It might not be obvious because it's bytes on a disk or whatever, but it's still material. So what you're trying to say is that you could somehow transfer the human body to a bunch of ones and zeros. That's not the matter. That's not a kind of matter that's capable of holding a human soul. So I don't see that.
Yeah, because this is saying that basically transferring from the carbon base, the silicon base body, right? That's basically what that means, right?
I don't find that very convincing. The problem is, for example, even artificial intelligences are not actually intelligent. They're just algorithms. And the intelligence actually comes from the program.
Could you repeat that?
Artificial intelligences, Google and all that stuff, Google and all that, are actually not intelligent. They're just algorithms. And the intelligent part, the smart part, is what the programmer has put into it. So all of the smartness comes from the people who have designed it. If you think about it. And believe my programmed computers are dumb. They really are. You know, you hit do this and it will do it, and even if it makes no sense.
se non ha nessun senso.
Okay, anything else? Okay, I think we should transition to the next talk. Thank you very much.